Welcome to the Testibus Christi Domini, the witnesses of Christ the Lord. And today we have a special guest to witness to one of the greatest Albanian witnesses to Christ the Lord, our national hero, Gjergj Kastrioti. We did a program in Albanian, but today we have a special guest who's not an Albanian and who dedicated so much time to study the history of Gjergj Kastrioti, Skanderbeg, and he actually has a book on it. So we're honored to have him today. So if you can introduce yourself to the audience.
Hi, my name is Brackob. I'm a historian and director of History of Books, which is a publishing house based in Las Vegas, Nevada, as well as Palm Beach, Florida. And yes, we publish a wide range of books on, well, pretty much every topic imaginable, but we do have a couple of books that I personally authored on Albanian history, one being my book Scanderbeg, and then another I have on the formation of the Albanian national consciousness, which discusses the 19th century intellectuals developing Albanian language and literature and sort of national identity at that time. So our people say, me t'luvdua tjetri, it's great that if someone else praises you, it's greater than you praising yourself. Mm-hmm. It's great when we as Albanians talk about national hero. That's great. Mm-hmm. We talk about our ethnicity, mm-hmm. our great heroes. We try to model them, like model Gjergj Kastrioti, Mother Teresa, Saint Jerome, mm-hmm. and all these great figures. But what an honor to have someone who's not Albanian to testify to our national hero and to our people and to our history. Well, thank you very much. Yes. No, I had a, when I was in graduate school, I have a Ph.D. in history, and when I was in graduate school, Eastern Europe was my focus, but studying in the 15th century became an area of focus for me, and of course, Skanderbeg being really the most critical figure in southeastern Europe in the 15th century, and really, in many ways, for all of Europe. I mean, the 15th century was a very critical time in European history. It was a transition period between basically the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, which sort of created the foundation of Western society for the last at least half millennium. And Skanderbeg really played a very critical role in that period, which unfortunately, today is really been forgotten by many people, and not by Albanian people who know what he did for his country and his people, but by other people outside of Albania. He's little known, and that was what really brought me to write the book, was because I wanted to make the story of Skanderbeg and what he did for Europe as a whole. So basically, what sparked your interest was, okay, there is this great figure that not many historians are interested in, and this is such a great figure not to go deeper and realize, like, what are the achievements that this guy had, and what did this mean for the rest of the Europe? Well, absolutely, but it was also about, here was a time, when the Ottoman Empire was spreading its influence into Europe, and at that time, no one knew if it was going to continue its path. I mean, 1453, you have the fall of Constantinople. I mean, basically that marks the end of the Roman Empire, because Constantinople, Byzantium, was the continuation of the Roman Empire. So 2,000 years of history ended at that time. So we're on the verge of a new era. Was the Ottoman Empire going to extend it all the way into Europe? I mean, Mehmed the Conqueror, when he took Constantinople, his goal was to take Rome next. Constantinople was just a stepping stone on the way to Rome. And one person stood in his way, basically. I mean, as a leader, and that was Skanderbeg.
And what's the easiest way for them to take Rome? Is through Albania.
Absolutely, they had to. That was very much proven. I mean, even after the death of Skanderbeg, when the Ottoman forces actually invaded Italy, and had, managed to get a beachhead in Otranto, which was ultimately, that plan was ultimately foiled, by Albanians rising up against the Ottomans and under the leadership of Scanderbeg's son, Gjergj Kastrioti at that time, who managed to, to basically subvert the Ottoman attempt to take Rome. But had Skanderbeg not existed, had he not organized such an effective revolt, against the Ottomans for 25 years, there's no doubt in my mind that the Ottomans would have succeeded in crossing into Italy much sooner and probably been successful in their attempts to get to Rome. So Italy may today be a Muslim, so Muslim country.
You're kind of like making my heart glad in two things. First of all is that because of primarily this man, our hero, I'm an Albanian and I have ethnicity. I'm not like a lot of Americans say, I'm a mud. I'm not a mud.
Right.
I know who I am,
Right.
And second one looks like my Catholic faith, first of all, is dependent on God. But second of all, it's again dependent on my national hero.
Well, he certainly did a lot to preserve it. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, there were, as the Ottoman Empire expanded into Europe into southeastern Europe in the 15th century, I mean, there's several, key players that in the resistance to Ottoman expansion. You had, John Hunyadi, who was the royal governor of Hungary. He led a lot of the anti-Ottoman resistance, to the north and northeast. You had the great revolt led by Vlad the Impaler, or Dracula, in what's Romania today. So he had led the revolt there against the Ottomans. But those, in the end, that wasn't the thrust of where the Ottomans really wanted to go. I mean, the Ottoman goal wasn't to. I mean, what they did was important in resisting the Ottomans and causing difficulties for them. But the Sultan's goal wasn't to go north; it was to go west. I mean, and that's really where the heart of European civilization at that time rested with Rome. So, the most important figure he's a Skanderbeg, because he's the one that defended the passage to Italy, essentially. Now, that doesn't mean that Skanderbeg himself that was his motivation, or he was necessarily thinking of that as his primary goal. His primary goal, of course, was to defend his people, his land, his culture, his civilization. I mean, those were the motives, I think, that inspired him, apart from, defending the faith. But I mean, his goal wasn't to defend Italy necessarily, but that was a consequence of, what his actual goals were. So I think, he played a very critical role in doing that. And had he, as I said, he was a remarkable leader, Skanderbeg, one that really people, again, today don't appreciate as much as people in centuries past have appreciated him. There's a famous quote about from a British general, James Wolfe, who was famous for the Battle of Quebec in Canada during the French and Indian War in the 18th century. A famous quote in a letter that he wrote, talking about how Skanderbeg really was one of the greatest military tacticians of all time in all of history. And he lamented even then that he wishes he had access to more information about his life and his battles and things. But that just shows how appreciated he was, as a military leader, as a political leader. So I think that really Skanderbeg, played such an important role in defending ultimately European civilization and allowing for Europe to develop the way it did. Because had Mehmed the Conqueror been able to extend his influence into Rome and actually conquer Rome, which was his goal, we would have been looking at a very different last 500 years of European history and ultimately Western civilization, because you have to remember, even our American civilization comes from that time. Exactly, yeah. And spread. So you can't say enough about what Skanderbeg did.
It's really interesting what you're saying here, because one of my cousins was speaking to me one day. We were talking about faith. He said, I lost faith. And I said, why? He said, well, when I went to college. And I said, well, education should bring you closer to God, who's the intelligence himself. Like, how did you lose your faith? I said, but man, don't you know, he said, crusades? I'm like, yeah, I'm not stupid. I know crusades. But he said, you know what they did? I'm like, yeah, well, if there was no resistance, then your mother would be wearing a hijab today.
Yeah.
And his mouth dropped.
Yeah.
He's like, what? I'm like, yeah. Because I'm like, look what happened to the Constantinople. And one of the ways why resistance came and crusades went was because Orthodox brother called us and said, we're decimated. We're destroyed in here. And they said, we got to resist. I know Jesus said, forgive our enemies. But Jesus said, Jesus also tells us to be wise. And we have to be, defend ourselves and defend our families. So it's very interesting that you bring in that point.
Well, and remember, I mean, the goal of Islam under the Sultans is to really conquer the West, conquer Christianity, conquer. It's a religion based on jihad. It's based on warfare, and its ultimately goal is to destroy Christianity. And that is what Skanderbeg stood up against at that time. And other leaders in southeastern Europe at that time. So it really shouldn't be underestimated. But I think sadly, too few people today understand the achievement that he did and how difficult it was. It wasn't just simple. I mean, people oftentimes today think, well, it just happened to be at that place at that time, and that's what happened, and it was inevitable. But by no means was it inevitable, that he would be able to resist the Ottoman invasions for 25 years successfully. That was not a given. Up until that time, the Turks had made very steady progress into the area. The rebellions in Albania in the 1430s, showed that they really couldn't stand up against Ottoman power. But what happened is that Skanderbeg managed to organize a very effective resistance, overcoming a lot of obstacles. And the obstacles were Albania was not a centralized state. There wasn't a kingdom of Albania, or so to speak, or empire or something. I mean, a centralized government, let's say. It was, divided amongst wealthy landowners, and each had their own regions, of course, and managed to, while one would fight the Ottomans, if the other one got a better deal, he would turn on the other, and you had a lot of that inner fighting between, different Albanian leaders, and that's sort of what undermined the efforts by Albanians to resist the Ottomans in the 1430s. And then Skanderbeg comes along in 1443 and begins his rebellion, taking Croia. But then, the nobility gets together at Leja in 1444 and establishes the League. Now, what was the League? The League was something that Skanderbeg had conceived as a way to bring about these, different nobles with their different lands and resources, and to try to get them to agree on a form to, to organize a resistance, because they saw from the previous decade that it was going to be ineffective if everybody's just doing their own thing. So he managed to do that. In doing that, though, he shrewdly managed to create himself where he was the sole commander of the army. And he had control of that military, and by doing that is that he was able to build an army over the next, basically 5 or 6 years, where he made the soldiers fighting under him dependent upon him. He instilled loyalty in his troops. He lived with his troops. He ate with his troops. He trained them carefully. And he would get rid of, gradually weed out the ones that weren't so loyal or had different interests than what he did, and he managed to create a unified military force, which was the only way you could resist the Turks. I mean, they were just, too strong and too, had too much organization.
And that just shows, as Albanian, I understand how hard is for us to unite for something because of we have a tribal mentality.
Yeah.
Even right now, if you talk to us, even in America, we fight with each other. No, Triesh, Hod, Grud, Kastrat, Kelmen. You know, for my village, they say you're not even one of the villages. You know, you hard. It's like we have all this like personal interest. So it's almost like a miracle.
Yeah.
He ended up uniting. Forget a lot of villages around us. Most of Albanians for one cause. So it's almost like you see like a divine assistance there, because humanly, with us Albanians, the hardest thing we have is to unite, you know, and yet he managed to do it.
He did, and it really is a tribute to his intellect, that he understood what needed to be done. He understood how to get it done, and also his skill as a military commander, in order both to organize his army and to use it effectively, because regardless, he's always dealing, you know, for the most part, with a much smaller force than his enemy. So he's always got to take into account. Now, I mean, you know, he knew how to skillfully use the terrain to his advantage, and to defend, you know, to defend his country in the best way. But that was by no means something that was a given, and it's by no means something that just any leader could have done. And the result, I mean, ultimately, was when Skanderbeg passed, you know, it fell apart.
Yeah.
And it fell apart because there was not that person to step in and take his place, and you know, to hold all that together and to manage it in the way that he did. It's really a testament to his importance as a leader of his people.
So when did the especially Western academia started taking more notice of, started taking more interest to know about Gjergj Kastrioti? We call him Gjergj Kastrioti because his Skanderbeg name is given by Turks. So
well, I mean, but he used that name as well. Course, I mean, of course. So I mean,
yes, that became like his title, you know.
Yeah, I mean, a sort of a thing of honor.
When did they start like exploring him more?
Well, I mean, I think, unfortunately, I don't think he's been explored enough. I mean,
course,
to this point, it's still to the point where it still isn't taken into consideration enough. And even if you read a lot of more generalized histories about the region or the time period and things, you'll find a lot of them barely will mention Skanderbeg or mention him in passing, you know, rather than going into detail, when here he is, you know, one of the key figures for that. As far as, you know, bringing some attention to him in the West and outside, of course, that really came through Albanian immigrants to the United States, like Von Noli with his book on Skanderbeg was very important in sort of making his story a little more known to a Western audience. But there were, you know, Skanderbeg did attract a bit of attention, especially amongst people interested in you know, in military history and the Turks. But everything that was published, like in the mid-19th century, there was a book, I think it was Clement Moore or someone, but basically it's a retelling of Barleti. I mean, it's not, you know, much original research in there. So I think we still have a long way to go with Skanderbeg. I think there's still so much more that can be done, and there's so many, you know, documents. I think, as your previous guest had spoken to, there's so many documents that are yet to be discovered.
Her program went for 3 hours, and we couldn't get much through it, you know.
Yeah, and so many documents yet to be discovered, though, and so many, you know, exciting new things. I mean, by no means is medieval history a closed book. You know, it's something that still is to be written,
especially for Albanian part of the history. It's a book that's just opened.
Yeah,
you know, because there's so much more. I have one question that I always had in my mind, and you as an American, watching American movies, probably, I don't know, did you ever think about it, but I'm going to ask you. As an Albanian, I always think you have these great movies like Braveheart. Well, we don't know that William Wallace, was he a real historical figure the way it's portrayed in a movie?
Of course.
Then we have Gjergj Kastrioti, Skanderbeg. A real historical figure, winning battle after battle they had no business of winning, uniting people that's only by God's providence you can unite. He's defender of Europe. He's defending it. He's defending the Vatican, you know, the Rome.
Yep.
He's also blocking the access for Ottomans to get to Vienna. He's like a seal there. He's you know, like when a wolf is attacking sheep. If you have a sheepdog, he's not gonna defeat the wolf on its own, but he's just gonna do enough to call the shepherd and say, what is going on? What is this noise? You know? And that's what he did. He did enough to stop the Ottomans for just having a free path to Vienna, free path to Rome. So if his writings or if his history was explored more, I mean, do you think it would be a blockbuster movie of Hollywood?
Oh, I think it could be a great movie, but I think even more effective might be a miniseries where you can really have the time to tell his story, because it does stretch, you know, a quarter of a century. It's not a story that can easily be told in, you know, 2 hours of a movie. You know, it's something.
It's not one battle. It's not just
exactly. Or even 1 year or something.
It's
that's
very
a
interesting.
quarter of a century. You know,
yeah.
And there's so much to explore there. But to tell the story effectively, I think, you know, a miniseries format would be perfect for that, because you could really delve into it. And there's so much material there, and you know, all of it true, basically, and you don't have to invent a lot of, you know, Hollywood type you know, things to embellish it.
You just need to read the documents. You don't need to write a brand new script. Basically, you just got to base it of the true story.
Follow the true story, and you know, they might be able to add in their little romantic elements and things that they need, like, for that type of stuff.
But Donica and, you know,
where we don't have evidence.
Just imagine headlines of the movie, or, you know, like a preview. You know, according to the true story, Gjergj Kastrioti, Scanderbeg, the athlete of Christ, defender of Europe, defender of Rome. I mean, that itself would just speak volumes. Like, people who don't know anything about it would say, I want to see that movie. So if Steven Spielberg or anybody's watching us, we're giving you all this we advice for free, you know.
can help with the consulting on that. But it would be, ultimately that would be a great thing. Whatever we can do to make what Skanderbeg's accomplishments and his achievement better known is all for the good. Be it, you know, documentaries, be it, you know, a miniseries or a movie or something, and be it books that are important. Whatever we can do in that regard is important, because people need to understand how it is, you know, we got to where we are. Because if you don't understand your past, your future is already lost. And unfortunately, that's, you know, some of what we see going on is a distortion of the past, so that you can create this, you know, this blank slate, so to speak. But that's not, you know, what civilization itself is always founded on the past.
So, like I said in the beginning, it's so much greater when someone who has no bias in a subject testifies to it. And because slowly, at least in that region, the story of Skanderbeg is very important. People know it. What happened is everybody wants part of him. So the Greek says he was Greek. The Serbians say he was Serbian. Montenegrins created the story of a Skanderbeg, of the king of Zeta at the time, Ivan Crnojević, who had a son, Stanisha, and says he was a Skanderbeg. It's kind of like pretty much same story, you know. You see, it's a copy, you know. So they all claim him as our own. Sometimes it's, when I tell people, well, no, he was Albanian, they say, you say that because you're Albanian, but Serbian says, no, he's a Serbian. So,
but what's important is, what did Skanderbeg say? He said he was an Albanian.
That's what I want to...
What did the Pope say? He said he was no. Everyone said he was no.
This is what I want you, if you can explore a few minutes on this. You have no bias at this. You're American. You live in Vegas. You have no bias. What did Skanderbeg say? What do the archives say? What do the documents say?
No, everything says that he was an Albanian. Skanderbeg himself, in his own letters and things, was, you know, calls himself an Albanian. The Pope, when he's writing to him, several popes, not just one, said he's an Albanian. There's just no, anything created after that is basically, these other, things that have been thrown out there are basically, complete speculation, but they're based really on 19th century nationalist motives rather than reality. Where the reality is what's in the documents and what at the time,
especially the earliest documents. You wanna weave through the documents, and you always take the earliest written sources. And
Absolutely.
In anything, we don't take later source to prove that original source was not right. So original sources, you're saying that all claiming he's Albanian.
Well, absolutely. And then you look at the lands where his grandfather had started with only a couple, he was a very small landholder with a couple of villages, but these are Albanian lands, have always been Albanian lands and still are, inhabited by an Albanian population. So how all of a sudden do you have out of that, where do you have somebody who's Greek, Serbian, Montenegro, whatever, where does that all come from? That's invented. It's not reality. Reality is that, Skanderbeg was an Albanian, and he never thought of himself as something else, so why should anyone else take that seriously? Really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask you the same question that I asked Eteva, because historically now, she explained it really wide for Albanian-speaking audience.
Yeah.
But I know this program might be listened by a Serbian who speaks English, or a Montenegrin, or a Greek. Serbians claim, he was a Serbian for sure because his father, John, was buried in Hilander, which is a Serbian Orthodox monastery in Ethos, Mount Ethos. So they say, if his dad was buried there, that means he was of Serbian origin. And plus we know Vojsava, they call it Vojslava, that means she was Serbian. So this guy is 100% Serbian blood.
No, for one thing is that people have to remember that people in the Middle Ages didn't think of themselves in this national identity sort of concept. That's a 19th century construct. It's not something that was common to the Middle Ages. Middle Ages people thought much more about their social status, as whether they're part of the nobility, as far as their relations with the church, what donations they might have made to the church. It didn't matter if you would be Albanian, Serbian, Greek, whatever you were. That's not as important. What's important is you're a member of the nobility, that you maybe donated to a monastery or something. I don't know enough about the specific circumstances, to speak in detail to that, but I think it's just wrong to think of those things in 19th century terms of nationalism, when the Middle Ages was not about that. People weren't thinking of themselves.
First of all, they were part of the empire, and then this national aspect came later.
But even above that, that they were Christians, that they were Catholic, that came above everything else as well.
Yeah.
That was more important than. So
the way I kind of see it is like right now in America, like Orthodox is a little different from Catholicism, but to die, if I die in America, and I want a Christian burial, and there's no Albanian church, and if I'm buried in an Italian church, that doesn't make me an Italian.
No. So
this is what Serbians are playing with this. They're like, well, his dad is buried there. Well, he was a believer, and his brother, according to some documents, was a monk. So they're believers. So if they are in Albanians had no Albanian monasteries, as far as I know, an Albanian church. Serbian had that Orthodox church, and they felt, okay, we are not Muslim, definitely we are Christian, so if he's buried in Hilander, that doesn't change his nationality, but it just shows adherence to his Christian faith.
Oh, that's very true. And keep in mind, Skanderbeg was not on the best of terms with Gjergj Brankovic, who was the Serbian ruler at the time, and who really, impeded him joining the Christian army at Kosovo in 1448. So, it's just wrong to think of these things in ethnic terms, because it wasn't about that. Nationalism is a 19th century construct. This idea of national identity, and I have another book, obviously, about the formation of Albanian national consciousness, and it
What's the name of
talks
that
a lot
book?
about. It's called The Formation of the
Okay,
Albanian
so
National Consciousness.
We'll put the links to both
okay.
books on the description of the video, and
Okay.
whoever watches, just click on description. I'll probably put it and pin it on the comment section too. So,
Okay.
so it's just wonderful to
Yeah.
hear this from a unbiased source, because if I'm talking to a Serbian right now, or Greek,
Yeah.
we would have probably been heated by now, you know. And it's a time when no one listens to, you know, either side. But
Yeah.
when you have an outside source to speak about this, and it's just wonderful. So
Yeah.
So how much how much time did you spend on archives? Like,
Well, I spent a lot of time working on the documents surrounding, you know, Skanderbeg and translating those, you know,
what
into
was
English.
the primary base, if you want to say? Where did you spend most time, kind of?
Well, I mean, mainly in university libraries, you know, in the United States. Although I did get some help with sources from Albania. I mean, this was when I was doing this research. It was, you know, the very end of the communist period, and you know, I had gotten to know a few scholars from there. And they were helpful in providing some sources and getting, you know, volumes of documents, you know. But remember, this is back before the all the tools we have nowadays with the, you know, the internet and everything else. So that, you know, translating these things took a lot of time because you're working on it manually.
So you translated them?
Yeah.
From
yeah.
which language?
From either Albanian or French, or, well, French not so much. I'm French in secondary sources. I deal with a lot of some French stuff, but you know, working with some of the Latin documents as well. So it was a lot of work, you know, and took a lot of time, but it was you know, it was important, and I really, you know, very passionate about the story itself of Skanderbeg, because I really think that of all the and really some great historical personalities of 15th century Europe, when you think of, you know, again, you know, Vlad the Impaler, and who's obviously the most famous because he's gotten the most press since the novel Dracula came out, but also, you know, John Hunyadi, and there's many others as well, who played an important role in that time. Stephen the Great in Moldavia, to mention another. You know, they all played a very important role, but the most important role, I think, from a European perspective, from the standpoint of what the most impact for all of Europe was Skanderbeg and what he did. Because if he wasn't there, and if the Ottomans had passed into Italy, you know, much sooner than they ultimately did, I don't think they would have been stoppable, especially given everything that was going on in Italy at the time. Because remember, the Italians were always fighting amongst themselves.
Yeah, all these national states.
Yeah, always fighting amongst themselves.
It's really interesting because how you really like brought this light to me. You know, this is like a class for me. I'm a student, and when you said it lasted 25 years, we have a great act of Jan Sobieski and Winged Hussars, who comes and defends the gates of Vienna. But it's like it's a great battle, but it doesn't last 25 years.
No,
you know, I mean,
no.
And in historical writings, it said, you know, famous quote by Jan Sobieski: "I came, I seen, I conquered."
Yeah, Caesar's quote as well.
Yeah,
you know.
yeah. What we can say for Gjergj Kastrioti is almost like, I came, I seen, I conquered, and I kept defending what I conquered.
Yeah,
you know,
I stayed
like
there.
It goes a next step, you know, and
I mean, really, you have to think of Albania as the door to Europe, and Skanderbeg as the guardian of that door. And as long as he was alive, he didn't let anybody get through that wasn't supposed to get through. And that's really what it.
You know, it's really
comes down
interesting.
to.
We have a Albanian saying: when you want to defend someone, we say Do you understand any Albanian?
I can read some.
Yeah, yeah. So we have this saying that says, because when we were speaking upstairs, it seems like you understood a lot of stuff.
Well, I understand some.
Yeah. So there's this saying that we say, if I want to defend you, you're my guest, and I want to defend you, and you're attacked, we say, "Jo përkrye me gjall, not over me alive." You know?
Yep.
And that's what he did. He says, while I'm alive, jo përkrye me gjall. You're not going to conquer Europe. You're not going to conquer Rome while I am alive.
Yeah, and that's really the end result of that. But as I said, sadly, it's not that well known, and that's really what brought me to to write the book, is because there just wasn't much out there in modern scholarship.
When was the book published?
5 years ago. It was ultimately published 5 years ago. I did the research much earlier.
Have you had any person from academia or Albanian or a non-Albanian read the book and contact you and say, "Wow"?
Oh yeah, no, I've gotten quite a few good comments on the book and appreciation for what it does and for its documentation, which there's a lot of documentation there.
Because you are raising the awareness.
Yeah,
and that's the most important. There's because if 100 people read your book, then 100 people know about this great man.
Yeah.
If thousands of people read it, then thousands of people will know.
And hopefully it'll inspire others, in the future to do even more research and write other books and more books and explore, even more avenues. Because as we talked about earlier, there's so many more new documents that are becoming available and things like that. There's new directions that, this research can go. But we needed a base to start from, and something also, when I wrote this book, it was also written with the idea that it's a very solidly documented book. You'll see the citations. It takes you to the documents. You can you can see what's there, but it's also written in a way that's very accessible. It's not written in a way that's super academic. That's hard for the average reader who's not used to that kind of literature to read. It's written to be accessible for anybody to sit down and read and sort of come away with a good understanding of what Skanderbeg's life and career meant.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
So, like most of the programs we do, I am a student of theology, and faith is my primarily focus, because it takes us from natural to supernatural. I believe as humans we are created for supernatural. St. Augustine had said, "God, you created me for you, and without you I cannot find rest. Only in you I will find my rest. I will find meaning of my life." How much do we know about his faith life?
About Skanderbeg's faith life? We know that he was a very devout Christian. We know that he was very much appreciated, by the popes and by other religious leaders and secular leaders, of course. But we know that he was despite all the stories of him having to convert to Islam as a child and things like that, which was not an uncommon thing going on. But it was all very superficial, for political purposes. But ultimately, I think not only his words and the words of others, but also his actions prove, his faith and devotion, to Christianity and the Christian cause. And ultimately, as I said, he really is, perhaps the most critical figure of the time in saving Christianity and preserving Christianity.
So we have this figure. It's really interesting, because as Albanians, we are divided between Orthodox, Catholics, and Muslims.
Yeah.
With Orthodox, the division is more on the, not so much on theological aspects as much as national aspects and everything else. And so we have Scanderbeg, Gjergj Kastrioti, according to a lot of historians. His dad was Orthodox. He's born in a region where they were Orthodox.
Yeah.
Then by some people, as a child, perhaps, only thing you have to do to convert to Islam is say Shahada.
Yeah.
So as a child, he could have probably just recited Shahada and became a Muslim.
Yeah.
And then we see end of his life is a Catholic. He experienced it all.
Well, keep in mind one thing, though. This is a time that in 1439 you have the Council of Florence, which its whole purpose is to unite the two churches, and did so for a brief time. They united on the 4 points of the union. So that had, I think, a very strong effect in Albania, especially because in Albania, as you said, it wasn't so much about the theology. It was much easier to impose, or not to impose, but to be accepted, the union of Orthodoxy and Catholicism. And it lasted there, I think, much longer than it did. I mean, ultimately, it collapsed with the fall of Constantinople and everything else, of course, because the Ottomans then, of course, wanted the Greek Church to be separate from, the Catholic Church anyway. So I think the Union of Florence, though, being only, taking place only 4 years before Skanderbeg began his revolt and took Croia, I think that's a key element as well in helping to sort of bring that religious unity to Albania under Skanderbeg, and that took it in the direction of, Catholicism and being close to the Pope, Skanderbeg, and everything there. So I think that shouldn't be forgotten. That it all ties into the Union.
Were
of
you
Florence.
able in this book and through your research to translate any sources of correspondence between Skanderbeg's secretary and the Pope?
I hadn't had a lot of that at the time when I was doing the research on this, but I'm well aware of it, and I think it's, as I said, there's a lot of directions that future research can go in this and should go.
And this is what we are as people hoping. For those who speak Albanian, they have to watch the program we did with Etleva, and she goes deep into it. She said we just started opening.
Yeah, brand new.
Slowly opening some documents from so many that we have in Vatican archives in France, in Vienna, and everywhere else. So this is the hope for our people, because growing up, I grew up without sense of national pride. I grew up with Serbians. I went to school with them, and if I heard about Gjergj Kastrioti. I heard that he was a Montenegrin, and I believed it, because that's what you believe what you're told when you're a child.
Of course,
you go to school to be educated, not to be perverted, And then when I started caring for history, I was like, well, okay, now I have this national pride, but how am I to talk to Greeks or Serbians or anybody else, because they have these great national figures? And we have nothing. We don't have writings. We don't have great national figures. So I kind of felt like, like a lonely child. I know I'm Albanian now, but I have nothing to play with. I mean, when you're a child, you tell another child, my dad's stronger than you, your dad, So even when we grow up like that, intellectually, we want to be able to to debate with people, combat and come back at people. So I had none of that. And when I became aware and truly started believing, wait a minute, this guy truly was Albanian. And this guy's a great hero. Single-handedly, that was one of the things that inspired me and kind of like awoken this national identity in me that was never there before. And even a lot of people tell me even now, it's like, well, when did you start caring? I'm like, when I started getting educated.
Yeah, and that ties into my other book on the formation of the Albanian national consciousness. It talks exactly about the awakening that you're describing for yourself is exactly the same awakening that a lot of Albanian intellectuals in the 19th century went through as well. And Skanderbeg was key in that also. I mean, really, modern Albania as a state without Skanderbeg would not exist, I don't think. I mean, he really formed the basis for creating that sense of national identity, national consciousness that was critical. Because remember, the Ottoman Empire ultimately wanted to divide up Albania into, different vilayets and, not make it not allow it to be a unified country. They were just treating it as, they're Muslims and that's it. They weren't thinking in any sort of ethnic or national terms. So, Skanderbeg is key to that. And he is, perhaps greater than most of the heroes of these other countries that you're talking about. In the end of what he accomplished and what he did.
It's so wonderful to hear from outside. Yeah. So because, right now I see it in our Albanian, especially in the ethnic regions of Albania. There is this great battle, and Skanderbeg is still there as a warrior for Christ and warrior for his own people. He's defined by bold. We cannot just, well, some people say, well, his religion was Albanianism. Albanianism is not a religion. Albanianism is a national identity. So besides national identity, we have our spiritual identity, because we are made of flesh and we are made of the spirit.
Correct.
And as our flesh, our blood, our natural identity is we are Albanian, and Kastrioti fought for that, you know. But spiritually, he was a Christian. He was a follower of Christ. So now we have this almost like crisis, but which are very good in a sense. Crisis that can bear fruit. I do apologetics to Islam, you know, and we have a lot of wonderful young Muslims, you know. And most of the Albanian Muslims are wonderful people. And so now Kastrioti has become that cornerstone. So a lot of them, a lot of imams are saying bad things about him. They're like, he killed our brothers. Well, they occupied us. Of course, he killed them to protect his own people. What's wrong with that? You know, he's defending them. But there are other Muslims who raise their voice against the imams. And they say, who are you to speak against our national hero? And I see it almost like a double-edged sword. Castriota cut at a time, it cuts back today, because a lot of Albanians are awakening to this, and they're going against their imams and their ideology, and they're saying, who are you? Why are you bringing us this culture that our people, our ancestors fought for it? So right now, some people are coming to Christ still because of this man.
Oh, absolutely, and keep in mind, Albanians at this time were Christians. There really were very few Muslim Albanians at that time. That's a later, you know, because of the Ottoman Empire imposing its control, creating the Timurid system and everything in Albania, that spread Islam there. But at this time, you know, at Skanderbeg's time, Albanians were Christians, and they weren't, you know, it wasn't like today. Today is a consequence of what happened afterwards. It's, you know, what you know, the Albanian people had Skanderbeg. What he did for Europe was a great thing, and he managed to allow the civilization that developed over the last half millennium to develop because of what he did. But at the same time, the Albanian people had to pay a heavy price for that. And, you know, people should be grateful to what happened. I mean,
we
Albania
are the recipients
became
today of everything he has done.
Well, absolutely, but also, I mean, just Albania, because it stood as that bulwark against, you know, the spread of the Islamic Empire, you know, beyond there, you know, Albania remained sort of behind the Iron Curtain of the Ottoman Empire in a way. Like, you know, and as well as other countries in southeastern Europe, but it impeded their economic development, their social development and things in ways that other countries, because of the sacrifice that they made, other countries in the West were able to flourish because of that. So, I mean, that should be taken into account as well.
Yeah, that's pretty powerful, you know, to see, because, it's happening because it's obvious to see, you know, when you debate an intellectual, someone who reads sources, reads history, it's pretty easy. You know, there were no Muslim before the invasion. No. You know, and even today, our young students, our smart, intellectual Muslims,
right?
It becomes pretty easy for them to determine, wait a minute, everything I learned my whole life, that's not the truth. One of the most beautiful stories that I heard was from a Muslim girl from a noble family. Once when she told me about her conversion, how she came to become a Catholic. All it took, she went home with her family and just asked her mom a question like, who lives in that mountain region? And her mom just said, oh well, Catholics. She asked like, but why? Oh, they had gone there to save their religion. That was enough of a spark for her to say, wait a minute. So that means they were prosecuted. That means they fled. That means they took sacrifice over earthly goods to save their soul. That means we were like them. That was enough of a spark for her to come back to her roots.
Yeah. No, that's great, because, I mean, it's true. I mean, Islam was the religion of the conquerors, and they're the ones that came and imposed it. But it wasn't natural to Albanian society at that time. I mean, it was a Christian society.
How long do you think as Americans will be able to freely say that Islam was a religion that conquers? Because it's a question as Americans.
Well, if anybody reads the sources, that's the reality
sure, but
of
like
it.
You know, many
they
people
don't
read.
Yeah, that's sadly that's the case. We live in a somewhat secular society,
so
which
in our
sort
media to say these things
Yeah.
right now, it's not very popular, even though it's true.
Yeah.
And when something's not popular, they just block it.
Yeah.
Like, don't bring that in here. We don't want to hear it. They don't want to hear the obvious truth. You know?
Yeah, but that's a problem, because when you distort the past and you lose your understanding of it, you leave yourself vulnerable to all the bad consequences that will come of that. And then there will, there have been and will be many.
So this title, Atleta di Cristo, given by the Pope, like, what did that mean to you first time you started exploring it? Like, what does this mean? There's this person, it's called Athlete of Christ. I mean, to be an athlete is a great thing. To be a LeBron James is a great thing. You're an athlete.
Yeah.
To be an athlete of Christ is of a little higher value, you know?
Well, no, it means you were one of the key defenders of the faith and of Christianity, and Skanderbeg, of course, was honored with that title, as were others. In that time, but it was certainly a very prestigious thing to be given that title by the Pope, and certainly in this case, it was very well deserved.
As a conclusion of this wonderful program, if you can highlight few key things from life, wars, if you read any, his military strategies or anything else, like a summary of what captivated your heart to see that this man is a great man?
Well, I think above all his skill and determination in uniting his people for a common cause, for a Christian cause, to defend the faith, and that he really went. There was a time in 1450 when Murad II, the Sultan, invaded Albania, and everything looked bleak. I mean, the Sultan came in with a huge army of well over 100,000 men, and the many Albanian nobles had deserted Skanderbeg, betrayed him, deserted him, thought that he was defeated and crushed. And he used every bit of skill that he had to resist the Ottomans, to attack at the right time, to use the terrain, the weather, all to his advantage. And ultimately, the Sultan had to withdraw, and Skanderbeg won a great victory against remarkable odds. And at that point, he was able really to consolidate his rule, because he saw who had betrayed him, who had turned his back on him. He took action to consolidate his power even further, because he knew that was the key to success. There was no other way you could resist the Ottomans if you didn't have that consolidation of power. So that, I think, to me was the key moment. That sort of ended the League of Legia that he had created in 1444, had pretty much ended at that point, because the nobles had already proved themselves ineffective as far as uniting. He only really had to deal after that with the Aryanidi, who he united with them through marriage with his wife Danica, and the Dukagians, whom he made a treaty with 4 years later in 1454, which the Pope helped to intervene there to help negotiate that. But really that took remarkable skill, and it really allowed him to continue his resistance effectively at a time when, 3 years after that, the Byzantine Empire fell. The Ottoman Empire was at its peak, and easily could have crossed over into Italy, into the rest of Europe, had they been left unopposed or opposed ineffectively by weaker leaders, which we had seen in the past. So that's really I think the key turning point to me, and I think that really shows Skanderbeg's effectiveness in doing that. And even when even after his death, as I was talking about earlier, with when the Ottomans did eventually get to Italy at the very end of Mehmed's reign, and he died while they were there. That resistance, even then, was a result of Skanderbeg and his influence and what he had taught his people and the example that he had set. Just the very fact, because after his death, Danica and his son, his only son, John, went to Sicily to settle on lands that King Ferrante of Naples had granted him for Skanderbeg's assistance in the wars in Italy. And he went there to settle but what did the Albanian leaders back in Albania, who were rising up against the Ottomans at the time, when they had started the invasion of Italy, what did they do? They realized from Skanderbeg's example that they needed to have unity and cohesion in order to create an effective resistance. And they called on Gjergj Kastriota to come from Italy back to Albania to be the leader of that rebellion against the Ottomans. And to me, that says it all. That's the legacy of Skanderbeg. Yeah. And
it continued even after.
Even after his death,
yeah.
His impact was so great that even more than 10 years after his death, that still had that great of an impact, and ultimately defeated that Ottoman invasion. Because had the Albanians not risen up, in 1481, the Ottomans very likely could have stayed in Italy and had a permanent base there. But they were forced to retreat because their supply lines were being cut by the Albanians in the revolts in Himar and Sopot. So that how many other leaders from history in that time period can you point to that have such an impact that even years after their death, what they did still was impactful and still defended the cause that he had spent his whole life defending.
Okay.
So
that's wonderful. Last question: true or false? A lot of people more who lean towards atheism, agnosticism. They try to paintbrush Skanderbeg as this. While his primary motivation was political. Any ally he would found, he would become of that faith. If he found allies in Orthodox, he would remain Orthodox. With Muslims, if he found allies, obviously he's fighting them. So,
yeah.
With Rome, he found allies. That's why he was Catholic. If there were Buddhist or Chinese there, if he found allies with them, he would have become of that religion. Is that true or false historically?
Oh,
according to what we know about him.
I would say that's false. Basically, that's a modern perception because we have such a secular society and we're so cynical and believe everything is just about, self-interest, but the medieval mindset was very different and they did not think in that way. Now, did people at time, change religion for political advantage? Yes, of course they did. And that would certainly be the case of, even Skanderbeg in his youth, in the Ottoman Empire. But that's a case of political expediency for a particular purpose because he was, actually a hostage of the Ottomans at the time. But I think his underlying faith always remained Christian and always did remain Christian. And you can see through both the documents that exist as well as through his actions that he was, a devout follower of the faith. And if it was so, cynical and superficial as you were describing, some people might portray it, I don't think the Pope would have been naming him as an athlete of Christ either, and other things. They didn't just hand out those things randomly. Those types of titles, they didn't bestow them randomly on people, and certainly not on people that they would consider as of dubious faith. So I think the answer to that is it's false.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. This was a wonderful program. I think many people will watch it and share this program. I'll put I'll repeat, I'll put the links of both of the books in the description, and also probably in the comment section, and pin them, buy them, and read them. You know, Saint Jerome had said, another great Albanian who's my spiritual inspiration, had said, ignorance of Scripture, it's ignorance of Christ. But we also say ignorance of history is, like many people said before us, if you don't know history, you're prone to make same mistakes. So learn your history, and above all, be honored that we belong to a nation that resisted all types of attacks to keep Christian faith. So let's model our Gjergj Kastrioti. Come back to your roots. Follow Christ. Thank you so much. God bless you, and we hope to have you here soon again.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.